Welcome to the CER podcast, Unpacking Europe. I'm Armida van Rij, a senior research fellow with the CER in London. Last week, new UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham was sworn in and announced his cabinet. Interestingly, he picked John Healey, former Defence Secretary under Keir Starmer, who resigned over disagreements about defence spending, as his Chancellor of the Exchequer. Wes Streeting became Defence Secretary, a newbie to defence. Today, we're going to be discussing priorities for the new Burnham government for UK defence and the UK's role in NATO as the alliance undergoes a period of profound transformation. I am delighted to have with me Lord George Robertson, former NATO Secretary General, and the only Secretary General to date to have activated the Alliance's Mutual Defence Clause Article 5 in response to 9/11. Lord Robertson, among many other things, one of them being Defence Minister quite some time ago, but he was also one of the three co-leads of the 2024 Strategic Defence Review and has been rather vocal lately in his criticism of the Starmer government's record on defence. Lord Robertson, thank you so much for joining me. Let's start with UK defence. Now, the UK is often looked to as a leader in defence and security by its peers in Europe. It is one of two nuclear armed states in Europe and has played an important role in providing support to Ukraine, both materially as well as politically through the Coalition of the Willing. But if we look below the hood, many would argue that the state of the UK's armed forces are poor, both in terms of readiness and capabilities. What's your assessment of the problem?
One of the problems that the UK has is that about 20 to 25% of the defence budget is taken up by the independent nuclear deterrent, which is hugely important in terms of being allocated to NATO and therefore part of the nuclear umbrella across the whole of Europe. But it does have the effect of squeezing the conventional resources available to do basically a global role that the UK has done up to now. So over the years, and I plead guilty as well, we've taken that holiday from history. We've assumed that things were good and that we didn't have a confrontation, and therefore the peace dividend could be taken. Therefore, our forces are hollowed out. We don't have the equipment, we don't have the ammunition, and we don't have the logistics that would be required in order to build readiness. And that's why John Healey in opposition, now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, remarkably, but when he was in opposition decided he would do a new kind of defence reform, and therefore myself, Richard Barron's, a former retired four-star general, and Dr. Fiona Hill, who had worked with Donald Trump, but who had written about Putin's Russia, asked us to look at defence in the round, and we did, and we came up with a view about the present situation. It's pretty dire, but also how to remedy it and get back to the kind of war readiness which alone is going to provide deterrence against any adversary taking a chance against the UK in the future.
And as you say, it's we'll get to the defence investment plan in a minute, but the allocation to Trident has gone up in that as well. So it's taken even a bigger piece of the pie, so to speak. So the UK's defence policy is premised on a NATO first principle, which it has to be. And this was very much underscored by the 2024 SDR. How do these readiness issues that you mention around lack of equipment, lack of people, lack of ammunition impact the broader alliance's defence and deterrence posture?
Well, clearly, the alliance has a number of force goals which they expect countries to deliver to the Supreme Allied Commander. And we at the moment are not actually able to do that, but we will eventually be able to complete that portfolio. But as I've said, the nuclear component is crowding out a lot of what we do. It's not taken account of in NATO in the force goals because it's an independent nuclear deterrent. There's a case, I think, for other countries to make a contribution towards it because it adds to their security as well. But rebuilding readiness is going to be the absolute priority. Now, in this respect, we are not alone. Most countries in Europe, certainly the non-US countries in Europe, the Europeans plus the Canadians, have yet to get to that level of readiness that will provide the kind of deterrence that is going to be necessary in the future. So if we're going to do NATO first, and we have to be, then we have to make a bigger and better contribution to the alliance. And the Strategic Defence Review actually says and spells out in great detail how that can be done over a 10-year timescale, even although that timescale has now had to be reduced considerably given what's happening in Ukraine and in the Gulf.
It's very interesting that you say there about your suggestion that other countries should contribute to the UK's nuclear deterrent, which I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you imagine that working.
I think it's a novel idea, but I think it's one which will have to be raised in the future. I've been in the Kremlin on a number of occasions. I met Vladimir Putin on nine occasions, and I can tell you that it is Britain's independent nuclear deterrent that moves the dial in the Kremlin. There is no doubt at all about that. And therefore it's a crucial, important part of the overall situation. And yet we're carrying the burden all on our own. Now, there might be some ways in which other people can contribute without it necessarily affecting the decision by the British Prime Minister at the end of the day, the ultimate day. So I think it should be in the mix. I think it should be on West Keating's agenda for raising at NATO meetings, because there could be some mechanism developed in order to make sure that a contribution was paid to what is a very, very substantial amount of money that is being paid, essentially not just for the UK's protection, but for the protection of the continent under the nuclear umbrella.
I mean, it's a very interesting proposal. And of course, Streeting listens to the CER podcast. So I'd be curious to see, whether this gets any traction. Of course, part of the challenge with the nuclear deterrent is that so many of our nuclear attack submarines are constantly in maintenance and are often not actually deployed at sea, which undermines that deterrence posture again, highlighting the readiness issues that you mentioned earlier.
It does, but it's the Trident submarines are at sea all the time,
Mm.
365 days a year, 24 hours a day. They are operational, and they are a source of worry to the commanders of any adversary, whether present or in future. So, the attack submarines will eventually get back to sea, and they're part of the overall posture, but they are not the actual missile carrying submarines, which are perfectly operational.
Yeah, important clarification. In terms of the UK Defence Investment Plan, which was recently published, much delayed, and it begins really to outline a pivot to a new way of war, which with much more emphasis on uncrewed or unmanned and autonomous systems, which is clearly also an attempt to learn lessons from Ukraine and Ukraine's successes on the battlefield. Now, in your opinion, is this plan good enough for the way in which the war is changing? And can you say a little bit about how Europeans as a whole should plan to fight Russia or others with less US involvement?
Well, we have to be ready. The non-US allies have got to be ready to fight on their own, and that is going to be crucial in the future. We can no longer depend automatically on the Americans being available, despite the fact that Article 5 involves them as well as everybody else. But in any event, the GDP of Europe and Canada combined is as great as it is in the United States, and therefore we should be able to defend ourselves much more than we are at the present moment. So the Defence Investment Plan points to the future. A number of their proposals are proposals that would only come in after 2030, which is the date that we're thinking that the Russian forces may well have been reconstituted in order to be able to attack the alliance. But they do point to that change in the way in which we think of war. Ukraine is not going to be the future war, but there are lessons to be learned there as well. And moving towards drones and autonomous vehicles and the whole question about uncrewed or unmanned activity is part of the way in which the future is taking place. Yeah, I've been at the Farnborough Air Display this week, and you begin to see now how the idea of manned flight is now becoming a thing of the past, and we've got to look to the future for different ways in which things can be done. And it's on display, crucially and brutal, in eastern Ukraine.
Now, in terms of NATO and what NATO is going to look like in future. Clearly, as you already hinted at in your last answer, we're going through a transition period for the alliance, with the US withdrawing some of its troops and some of its capabilities from NATO. We're in clear discussions about burden shifting within the alliance. The US is also overstretched and is likely going to be overstretched for quite some time, also in terms of industrial production. And so, really, Europeans are trying to take on more responsibility for defense and deterrence from the US. Now, in the past, it's always been clear that the UK had a very clear leadership role within NATO. It has always fielded the Deputy Secretary to NATO, as well as a number of other key roles. Some are questioning the UK's future leadership role in going forward because of some of those readiness and capability gaps and the way that the armed forces have been hollowed out. So, could you say a bit about what role you would like to see the UK play in this quote unquote Europeanized NATO? And how will the UK need to navigate relations with France and Germany and Poland, who are all big players in defense and security as well, to make this happen? Germany, obviously, the big spender on the block. Poland, very much a frontline state who is both spending but also developing its own capabilities very rapidly. France is in the same financial situation as the UK, but has a similar strategic culture to the UK. So, how will all these puzzle pieces fall into place?
They won't fall easily into place. We're going to go through a period where people are feeling the way forward in the sort of post-US dependency model. And I think it's worth saying at this point that in a way, the United States is beginning, I think, even under Donald Trump, to waken up to the fact that membership of NATO is actually a grand bargain for the United States. And they haven't been able to grasp that point in the past. I think they're going to have to do it, and maybe are doing it at the present moment, by sitting around a table every week with 31 other allies magnifies the influence of the United States in Europe and in the wider world. The $500 billion a year that is being spent at the moment by the European or the non-US ally magnifies what the United States is spending on defence. And of course, finally, crucially, since the Europeans are now beginning to spend more money, a lot of it has to be on American equipment because that's the only thing that's available off the shelf at the present moment. So it is actually quite a bargain. But we have in the past, and I'm guilty of this as well, have sort of talked about the Europeans not doing enough and the Americans having to do more, whereas in fact it has given them a disproportionate influence inside the alliance, and especially with a lot of allies who have always come to the aid of them as well. But in terms of the UK, our influence in NATO is, of course, not just affected by what we spend on conventional defence, but also by the fact that we have that independent nuclear deterrent, which counts very substantially for the protection of the NATO countries as well. So I don't see that our leadership role is going to be compromised simply by what we are doing in the conventional defence area. But at the same time, we need to do more. We need to build our readiness. We need to make sure that our contribution is going to add value. What Sakura says is going to be necessary for the defence of Europe. And we have to do more about Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty as well, which is homeland defence. Previously we didn't need to do that. We are an island nation surrounded by water and a long way from trouble. In the era of ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, undersea cables, and pipelines, we are as vulnerable as many of the mainland European countries as well, and we need to pay attention to that too.
There have been recent changes in the command structures and in the generals, or the nationalities of the generals who oversee the joint force commands in Norfolk, Burnham, and Naples, which have shifted from Americans to Europeans. Americans have taken some of the theatre commands over instead. Can you see a future in which SECA, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, is no longer an American? And what nationality would that person then be?
I don't see it changing
Mm,
from being an American. And even in his wilder days, when he was questioning Article 5, Donald Trump has not
mm.
done that. And he's continued to appoint an American. And that's an important stake in the ground think in terms of transatlantic solidarity as well. If it came to the bit that it was to be a European, then I think that would depend on the bartering that takes place over who's going to be the Secretary General as well. There isn't any fixed area for doing that. But, Germany is spending more, Poland is spending more. There is a greater awareness in some of the Eastern frontline states about the importance of NATO and NATO solidarity. But I met yesterday. I met the chairman and members of the Italian Senate, and they are very conscious about the threat from the Mediterranean and the southern flank of NATO as well. So I don't think we can discount that too. But I wouldn't sort of automatically select a country to take over, and I think we'll continue. I spoke yesterday to the Deputy SACEUR Air Chief Marshal Stringer. And I don't think that there is any real question at the moment about Britain continuing to hold that important position. But unless we do more and we're more ready in the future, then there will be people who will question us holding that very, very important position.
The other point I want to pick up on is what you were saying about the US and that they're slowly starting to realize what a grand bargain it was for them to have such a leadership role within NATO and to be part of the alliance. And of course, as Mara Karlin has written about in the past, who used to be in the Pentagon, a lot of US defense posture depended on its bases, its foreign bases, access to overflight, and all those things, which obviously, given US bases in Europe, was a huge advantage. I'm interested in what you say that a lot of European defense spending has to go to US equipment, because the way I see it is the US has a big industrial backlog, and actually, given the war in the Middle East and their usage of ammunition, it will take quite some time to replenish those stocks. And so Europeans have been pushed to the back of the line in some cases for, say, Patriot missiles and others. But I would also think that this is an opportunity to build up the European defense industrial base, and that where we can scale up or where production already exists, we should be doing that within Europe. And actually, if we need to fill capability gaps very quickly, we should perhaps be looking to partners in, say, South Korea, for example, who've been able to deliver tanks and other pieces to Poland within a 2 to 3 year timeline. So I'm interested in what you say about maintaining that transatlantic defense industrial base, and just wonder if I can push you a little bit more on how you see, I guess, a division of labor on that.
Well, I don't think you can predict the way in which it'll go. It will organically develop as time goes on. And people, if they're committing more money to defence and adding to capability outside of the sort of war readiness and the training aspects of the people, then the equipment has to be bought. And I think you make a valid point that the America is trying to replenish its stocks and giving priority to domestic production. The American defense companies, and I've been meeting some of them over the Farnborough week, are also now talking about producing in Europe. And I think that's going to be one of the ways that we move forward. It won't be easy for domestic companies to fill the whole gap, but a lot of the American companies now running out of skilled labor in the United States are now looking to develop their own manufacturing capability in Europe. So seeing it in a binary terms about sovereign capability, it can't be seen simply as domestically owned. It may well be sovereign capabilities based on American companies producing inside Europe as a whole.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And obviously, one of the key things that we saw coming out of the NATO summit a few weeks ago was the US looking to grant licenses for Patriot missile production to Ukraine, which obviously is very complicated, will take a very long time, but it does mark a shift more broadly.
Well, it does, and it means a softening of the ITAR regulations,
Yeah.
which is a big move by the United States. I'm not sure whether the president actually had the endorsement of the Congress when he made that decision about the Patriot missiles. There is some evidence to suggest that he'd done it unilaterally, but it's an indication of the way in which things are going. But Congress, at the moment, should be controlling the ITAR regulations, but the president, has that sort of bulldozer effect, certainly at the moment, and therefore he's able to do much more than would be laid down by the Congress and by the Constitution.
Sticking with the relationship with the US for a minute and just thinking about the UK context specifically, the UK has always had very close relations with the US. Perhaps, the special relationship is more special in Britain than it is in the US, but it's had, that relationship that's been built after the Second World War. They're both part of the Five Eyes Alliance, which is hugely important. Some of the Trident missiles, have to be partially serviced in the US. Starmer, when he was prime minister, rolled out the red carpet for Trump for a state visit, which was Trump's second state visit to the UK, which my understanding is quite rare for that to happen twice. And President Trump was also the very first foreign leader that Burnham spoke to on the day of his appointment, if I'm not mistaken. So, you've been in that position in the past, both as SecGen but also as Defense Secretary. It was a different world, but it was a difficult world. It was the year of 9/11. How do you think the new team in the UK should manage Trump?
Well, if we have to have a state visit every year, then we should consider that every mechanism should be used in order to keep alive the relationship that exists between the UK and the United States, especially since we are outside of the European Union. And I think it's been managed well by Keir Starmer. I think clearly Andy Burnham has learned very quickly that that's an important relationship to be maintained. But the committee that I chair in the House of Lords, the International Relations and Defence Committee, has just published a major study of UK-US relations, which concluded that things were changing in America by and large on a permanent basis to pivot towards the Asia Pacific. But that actually, in the short term, underneath the frothiness of the political establishment at the top, there is a working relationship that is very clear, very close between the UK and the United States. We provide and we add value to what they do, especially in the intelligence sphere and the Five Eyes Agreement, and that is appreciated. In the future, what we have to do is make sure that we are always adding value to the relationship. You can't take it on the basis of nostalgia or of emotion or simply the fact that we try to speak the same language. We've got to be seen to be adding value. And I think at the moment, that is definitely what exists.
Could you say a little bit more about what that adding value looks like in practice? I mean, you talk about intelligence. Is there anything else?
Well, I think intelligence and foreign policy are intimately connected. We've got a new foreign secretary, and it'll be interesting to see how he sort of develops relationships with the Trump administration. But much more importantly, it is at the lower levels. I was astonished when I took over as Defense Secretary in 1997 to find that we had over 1,000 of our personnel embedded in American institutions. Our contribution was positive and certainly more than most people would actually understand. So that is where we add value in terms of expertise, but especially in the intelligence collection and interpretation that they value very much.
And then finally, turning to the public, which I think is an essential part of any discussion on security and defense. One of your frustrations, which I can call it that, which you've spoken very openly about, as well as your SDR co-lead lead Fiona Hill, is regarding the previous Labour government's lack of consensus building among the British public for the spending trade-offs required to increase defence spending to meet the new NATO commitment of 3.5% of GDP being spent on core defence by 2035. Now, in your words from your recent Lord's Speaker's lecture, our country is not safe, we are underprepared, we are underinsured, we are under attack, which is quite a stark message. So there's a lot of detail on how to do this in the SDR, but can I ask you for your three pieces of advice to Burnham, Streeting, Healy, and others for how to go about building this national conversation on defence?
Well, apart from reading the paper written for the CER by a very distinguished member of their staff, um,
Thank you.
because I think that was a valuable contribution to that particular debate. So I strongly recommend that people read it. My three pieces of advice. Well, first of all, the organization of the national conversation has to come from the top, has to be led by the Prime Minister, and he has to depute it to people who will take that message out to every corner of the country. I think my second piece of advice is tell the truth. You know, don't alarm people, because I think that's one of the inhibitions at the moment. But just simply tell them that we are under attack, day and daily, and that we are vulnerable in a way that we have not been in the past, and that they need to do more about it. And my third piece of advice is make it clear that it's an all of country approach. They cannot any longer contract out safety of the nation to the armed forces, which are small in any event and going to have to be highly specialized in the future. So every citizen has a responsibility to the protection of the country. And I think they have to also make it absolutely clear in the national conversation that the preparations that are going to be required by all of the citizens are to do with civil emergencies, power cuts, power outages, data cancellation, than they are to do with warfare. And I think that's one way in which the message can be got over. Have you got candles? Have you got a wind-up radio? Have you got cash? Have you got water and canned supplies at home? Because you may need it if the electricity is switched off and you're no longer dependent on it. I think in that way we get the message over without alarming people, keeping them on side.
As you were going through that list, I was thinking in my head, do I have water? No, I don't actually. Do I have batteries? Yes, a few, but not many. Do I have a battery operated radio? No, I don't. It starts with ourselves, right? But I think that's absolutely right. And thank you for sharing those, especially because if we think about the way that Russia is already attacking the UK, it is very much in that gray zone. It is not by launching missiles at us, but it is by spreading disinformation, by mapping our critical infrastructure with plans to potentially disrupt that in other ways. So that's where the whole of society piece becomes so important.
It is a whole of society approach.
Mm.
The Scandinavian countries have got it, and they've organized it. They organized it well, and we need to get up to speed because if we're going to be safe, we need to do more.
Absolutely. That's a great message to leave it on. Thank you so much, Lord Robertson, for making the time and for joining us. And thank you to our listeners as well. Please do subscribe to Unpacking Europe wherever you get your podcasts from. We're going to take a summer break over August and we'll be back in September with more Unpacking Europe. So do tune in again then. Have a lovely rest of the summer.